Another bit of news coming out of Cresco I noticed was that they recently did a survey in partnership with YouGov and their Sunnyside retailers. And apparently the survey polled 5,000 Americans, is said to be representative of the American population. And the findings were that 1 in 4 Americans consume cannabis. And that's up from 16% in 2018. So that's a pretty big number. I was surprised to hear that number. I think it's essentially two things. I think, maybe it's always been a higher number than 16%, but maybe people are now, it's 2021, years later, more and more states have legalized, states like Montana, states like South Dakota. So, if we're talking representative population of the U.S., maybe people are more inclined to say, yeah, I consume cannabis from time to time, but also just more access. There are more stores as these markets open up, and people are, purchasing cannabis legally now. And so I think it's probably a combination of those two factors, but 25% of Americans, pretty interesting. I'm curious where like Sunnyside came in, their retail chain with the with YouGov, if they sponsored this, or if they were polling Sunnyside consumers, which would be strange, because I would imagine most Sunnyside shoppers are cannabis consumers. But they released this report in conjunction with YouGov, so just kind of neat to see some of those numbers and some of that growth of cannabis consumers.
Yeah, that's consistent with what we're seeing in the Gallup polls and the acceptance by and large of the American public. What is it now that favor cannabis? 80% or whatever it is right now. It's ticked up quite a bit over the last few years. So it's not surprising that as more people favor legalization, more people will be consuming it.
This is interesting, and I've been spending a lot of time thinking about it generationally speaking. Gen Z is now entering the workforce in strength, right? And so I think when you think about a generational shift, they're the first group of individuals who will enter the workforce, create their own wallet, and share of wallet is going into cannabis in legal adult use markets, where it's the first workforce that started with legal adult use markets all around them, to your point, Cy, of having access. And so they get to make a decision in terms of their share of wallet. Are they going to spend it on alcohol, or are they going to spend it on cannabis? Or are they going to spend it on pharmaceuticals, or are they going to spend it on cannabis? And I think it's a really different generational shift to enter into a world where I bet they can't even conceive of what it was like to call the guy from Vermont to ride his bike over to your apartment in Brooklyn. I'm not maybe speaking from experience, but it's how we lived in a different world when it was really inaccessible on a legal level. And so I think it's a really interesting generational shift. And I also think when you track the trends of millennials, which I just found out from an article over the weekend that I'm considered a geriatric millennial, which is potentially the most horrific name I could possibly conceive. The word geriatric in front of me at any time right now is not interesting. I would much rather just be a square in the Gen X category, but I think
You're weeks away from assisted living.
Yeah, so I think it's something that we have to contemplate, these generational shifts and preferences. Millennials are drifting away from alcohol, drifting into cannabis consumption, and I think that these are the things that make it more open to being talked about and more socially acceptable. We also know, I spent a lot of time studying millennials in my previous life, and they have a very close connection to their parents, and so things flow very fluidly between those generations. So you're talking about boomers and you're talking about millennials, and there's a lot of sharing. And so I think that cannabis is being talked about in households in ways that it wasn't always.
Listen to High Rise on all major streaming platforms and watch the visual on YouTube.